So my aim today is something very modest, to say something of what Jacques Lacan has to say about Samuel Beckett. This should by rights make for a very short paper, since Lacan in fact says, to borrow from the title of Simon Critchley's well-known book, very little, almost nothing, about Samuel Beckett. Certainly he says very little compared to what he says about Shakespeare, Paul Claudel, André Gide, Marguerite Duras or Edgar Allan Poe. And he says almost nothing at all compared to what he says, more pertinently to this paper, about James Joyce. The idea for this paper came from my disappointment at not finding Beckett's name on the contents page of an edited volume published in 2006 entitled Lacan, the Silent Partners. It seemed to me then that this was something of a missed opportunity on the part of the editor, Zizek, since the book was an attempt to set up some pairings between Lacan and other thinkers and writers beyond the usual suspects of Freud, Hegel, Joyce. And so what I want to say today very simply is that Beckett's name does in fact belong on the list of Lacan's silent partners, in much the same way as he might also be thought of as the silent partner of Joyce. But this latter silent partnership between Joyce and Beckett is less the one a biographer might reference, Beckett as Joyce's apocryphal amanuensis during the period of research for Finnegan's Wake, than that suggested by the difference between the loquaciousness of the Joycean textual economy and the minimalism of Beckett, of which we know Beckett himself to have spoken as the difference between addition and subtraction, omniscience and ignorance, omnipotence and impotence. It's that most ostensible difference between the Wake and Worsted Hoe, say, the one, according to Beckett, that we've only to look at their proofs to see. I have in mind two quotations that I'm sure you all know. The first is this: with Joyce, the difference is that Joyce was a superb manipulator of material, perhaps the greatest. He was making the words do an absolute maximum of work. The kind of work I do is one in which I'm not master of my material. The more Joyce knew, the more he could. He's tending towards omniscience and omnipotence as an artist. I'm working with impotence, ignorance. I don't think impotence has been exploited in the past. And the second is from a well-known interview with James Knowlson. I realised that Joyce had gone as far as one could in the direction of knowing more, being in control of one's material. He was always adding to it. You've only to look at his proofs to see that. I realised that my own way was in impoverishment, in lack of knowledge, and in taking away, in subtracting rather than adding. So before I say anything specifically about what Lacan says on Beckett, I want first to provide some context for these admittedly scanty remarks by saying something of the place literature holds within Lacan's teaching more broadly, and of the unique place he accords to James Joyce within it. Although this is arguably something he himself doesn't always achieve, Lacan certainly strives not to instrumentalise the literary text by using it simply to illustrate extant psychoanalytic concepts, but rather to position literature as the repository of a knowledge that psychoanalysis currently lacks and of which it can make use in its own practice, that is, in the clinical setting. Lacan is highly critical, for example, of Freud's discussions of art wherever they serve a purely expository function. Those of Freud's readings of literature of which Lacan approves are always those that generate new psychoanalytic knowledge rather than confirming already well-mapped clinical concepts and structures. Lacan's also extremely scathing about the kind of psychoanalytic literary criticism that indulges in crude psychobiography, that treats fictional characters, and all their authors as real people, that is, as Anne-Lazandes on the proverbial couch. And so if he does say very clearly that commenting on a text is like doing an analysis in Seminar 1, he also says just as clearly in his 1958 essay on Gide that psychoanalysis, in the proper sense of the term, it can only be applied as a treatment and thus to a subject who speaks and hears. So we do not then psychoanalyze a text, much less its author through the text. Rather, Lacan's comparison of the act of reading literature to that of doing an analysis should be understood in the very precise sense that the analysand rather than the analyst, and here Freud's hysterical female patients of the late 19th century are the paradigmatic examples, is herself always positioned as a source of knowledge from whom the analyst can and must learn. Lacan's most explicit pronouncement on the relationship between psychoanalysis and literature dates from 1971. In a piece entitled Littérateur, which is a written-up version of a session from Lacan's 18th seminar, and we'll be returning to this later because it's also where he mentions Beckett for the second time. Referring back to his treatments of literature contained within the 1966 Écrits, Lacan here makes the following unambiguous denunciation of what the Academy would generally understand as psychoanalytic criticism as, I quote, this literary smoochy-woochy with which the psychoanalyst who is short of ingenuity denotes himself, end quote. He goes on to refer specifically to his 1956 seminar on Edgar Allan Poe, which we will also be returning to, by clarifying his purpose there and in his treatments of literature more generally. I quote, my criticism, if it gives grounds for being called literary, could only bear, I try my hand at it, upon what Poe is doing as a writer in formulating a message about the letter. It is clear that in not saying it as such, it is not insufficiently, but rather all the more rigorously that he avows it. Nevertheless, the elision could in no way be elucidated through some feature of his psychobiography. It's certain that, as usual, psychoanalysis is here in receipt, from literature, albeit taking within its own jurisdiction a less psychobiographical idea of repression. For myself, if I offer psychoanalysis the letter as somehow undelivered, that is, en souffrance, it is because this is where it reveals its failings, and that is how I enlighten it, that is, psychoanalysis. If I thus invoke the Enlightenment, it is to show up where psychoanalysis forms a whole. In other words, at its worst, psychoanalytic literary criticism merely seeks to explain or explain away the literary text with recourse to psychoanalytically informed biographism. At its best, it is psychoanalysis rather than literature that always stands to gain. Literature and literary authors, like Freud's hysterics, know something that the analyst doesn't yet, and it is psychoanalysis that needs literature and men and women of letters, and not the other way around. Furthermore, if the literary is always identified by Lacan as a site of knowledge, it is a knowledge more precisely about the letter, as an area in which psychoanalysis often comes up short. So in more ways than one, it's the Joycean text and James Joyce himself that is the clearest example of this. Lacan first met Joyce in person in 1921 at the age of 17 and attended the first public reading of Ulysses. This reading gave rise to a lifelong fascination with Joyce and Joyce scholarship under the Mephistophelian tutelage of Jacques Aubert, who fed Lacan with new works of Joyce criticism and encouraged him to speak publicly on the subject. The first published trace of this enduring fascination occurs, however, in the well-known, aforementioned 1956 seminar on the Edgar Allan Poe short story, The Purloined Letter, which opens the écrit. Lacan's allusion to Joyce is here no more than a passing one, to the pun from Finnegan's Wake, the letter, the litter, and the soother, the bitter. Lacan here cites the first half of the pun only in the following terms. A letter, a litter. There's been some equivocation within Joyce's circle on the homophony of these two words in English. Following which, we find a misspelled footnote to the 1929 Shakespeare & Co. edition of Our Examination round his factification for incamination of work in progress, in which there appears the letter to Mr. Joyce by one Vladimir Dixon, to which Lacan here refers. So it is possible, but by no means certain, that Lacan had read something of Beckett's, obviously his Dante Bruno Vico Joyce, by 1956, albeit something by his hand about Joyce. And at this early stage in Lacan's career, what interests him about Joyce is the equivocation between the two English words, letter and litter, in which Lacan finds a particularly succinct rendering of a knowledge about the letter that he also gleans from Poe. So this story, The Purloined Letter, as some of you may know, is the tale of a piece of written correspondence addressed to a queen that goes missing, and which it falls to a hapless detective, Dupin, to retrieve before it falls into the wrong hands. In the story, the content of the letter is never revealed. We know only as readers that it is in some way compromising for the queen. Part of Lacan's point in his reading is thus that it is in no way necessary to sustain the dramatic tension for Poe's readers to know what the letter says. And yet this inscrutable letter makes its rounds, animating the character and their relationships one to another. In this way, Poe formulates a message about the letter, Lacan says. And that message is, of course, this. A letter always arrives at its destination. So in other words, Poe's purloined letter takes its course within the textual world, much as the inscription within the unconscious does, as a written, and yet to the subject illegible trace, which animates her and shapes her path. I do not need to know what the letter says for it to be furnishing structure. It will do so nonetheless, as surely as the stamp guarantees passage to the relevant address, albeit often taking its time. And so when Lacan cites Joyce in 1956, it is to underscore the fact that this letter, which at one point in Poe's story is tossed into the wastepaper basket, is mute, empty, yields nothing, but that it takes on value within the symbolic order of exchange by virtue of its absence therefrom as an object of knowledge, rather like Lacan says, that a book that is missing from the library shelf. So it's in this sense that Poe's purloined letter is a sort of litter, a throwaway scrap, that paradoxically governs the textual world from its subordinate position, where its content barely appears to count, and yet accounts for everything by not actually appearing. It's in this sense that Joyce appears also to acknowledge in his equivocation, it's this that Joyce also appears to acknowledge in his equivocation, a letter, a litter. If Poe's text and Joyce's pun can provide psychoanalysis with some knowledge about the letter, it is, in the most general of terms, that the unconscious is structured like a language, insofar as it is a receptacle, rather like a dustbin, for the letters as litter about which the subject herself knows nothing, but which nonetheless animate her existence through the symptom. This is why the symptom is often figured by Lacan as a kind of envelope in which a letter is enclosed. At this stage in Lacan's teaching, he considers the symptom as an unconscious formation along Freudian lines as a message to be read, a message addressed to the other, where the subject speaks through her body. But if Joyce makes a cameo appearance in this Poe seminar, it's not until the early 70s that Lacan's mining of the Joycean text really gets going, beginning in Seminar 18 and reaching its apogee in Seminar 23, entirely devoted to Joyce, entitled Le Saint Homme, although allusions are also made to him in the intervening years and continue thereafter. In Seminar 18 of 1971, in the session that became the published text Littérateur, where Beckett appears, Joyce is evoked in terms that conform to the way in which Lacan generally treats the literary, namely as a kind of analysand who knows something the analyst doesn't yet about the letter, but with a crucial twist. Lacan here recalls the fact that Joyce was once offered an analysis by some nameless well-wisher, and with Jung to boot, as one might offer a shower. Joyce passed up the offer, and rightly so in Lacan's view, since he would have gained nothing from this little game of ours, going straight to the best that one can expect from psychoanalysis at its end. So in his engagement with Joyce at this point, what intrigues Lacan is the way in which Joyce manages, through writing, to create something that enables him to circumvent the analytic process. That something is to have testified in his writing to a kind of jouissance associated with the symptom, but which bypasses the creation of meaning, that is, sens. And this is a kind of jouissance that Lacan will go on to term jouissance, S-E-N-S, or enjoyment, as it's often translated. So indeed, Joyce's achievement initiates a new phase in Lacan's teaching on in what exactly the end of analysis might consist. This shift is, broadly speaking, away from the end of analysis as a sort of cure towards pragmatism, and is to be understood in the context of Freud's trajectory in his thinking of the symptom. By the end of his career, Freud had reached the conclusion, following the failure of so many analyses successfully to liquidate analysand symptoms, that psychoanalysis may need to be a lifelong process. Now, this is the theory advanced in his analysis, terminable and interminable, of course. Lacan, for his part, becomes in one sense more optimistic than Freud, in another still less so. If Freud had suggested that analysis was in some way interminable, then perhaps it was rather this end point itself that required rethinking. And so what he finds in Joyce's writing is precisely something that functions like a neurotic symptom, but which is not a symptom, at least as Freud had understood it,